Hey guys, in this video we will start looking at stored procedures in Microsoft SQL Server. Now, stored procedure is pretty much prepared SQL code that you can save and reuse at will. Stored procedures are rather versatile. You can use them to pretty much carry out any CRUD operation on the data. Once you call it, you can pass in parameters or you can just call it. It depends on how you define it, really. And in this video, we're going to build a few just to see exactly what they are capable of. Now, to get started with stored procedures, you would have already logged into your Server Management Studio, and you can just expand your server, go into the database and go to programmability. And right there, you'll see stored procedures. You can right click that and click stored procedure. Now, before we even get into this, it is noteworthy that there are quite a few system stored procedures. And if you expand that, you'll see a nice long list of stored procedures that are available to you by default just by having SQL Server. However, none of these are really designed to interact with the database in question, which is our school database that we've been building. And so we would probably want to define some stored procedures that can interact with the database. Once you're creating a stored procedure, you'll be given a template. And if you've done functions, then you would realize that this template looks very much like functions. It's almost like you've done one, you've done all. The only major difference here is that instead of saying create function, it really says create procedure. All right, but then everything inside the angle bracket needs to be replaced just like we would have done in the other template files. So for this procedure, I'm going to call it select all students. So I'm going to replace all this text from one angle bracket to another, and I'm just going to give it the name select all students. All right, so select all students. And then for select all students, we really don't need any parameters. Now, in this section, we would add the parameters, and a parameter can be an outside value that we're passing into the stored procedure, and that value could help inform the results. So we could have select all students with no parameters versus select a student where we're accepting a parameter of maybe an ID or something like that that would help us to run our query for that specific reason. In this situation, select all students, we don't need any parameters. So for this example, I'm going to erase that entire section that is suggesting that we have a parameter. And so we have create procedure, no parameters, as, and then begin. So after begin comes the body. We don't have to change this, at least not for this example. But then what we need to do is create statements for our procedure in this section. So what I am about to do is select star from students. So we're starting off with a nice simple example. So we have a students table and we're selecting star from students. And that's pretty much it. So that's it to creating this first stored procedure. And once I'm sure I have no more red lines, I can always click execute, because once again, this is a script and it's running an create procedure command. So I need to actually execute the script at the end. So I click execute, and then it will tell you commands completed successfully. If I refresh my stored procedures list, then I will see my stored procedure select all students. Now, to use this stored procedure, and I'll just open up a new query window and make sure that I'm using the school database that we're working with. To execute this stored procedure, I simply need to type the word exec, or which is short for execute really, but it's exec. And then I call the name of the stored procedure. So it is select all students. And I may need to qualify this with the DBO object. So I'll just put my DBO object. Remember, once you put DBO, it kind of opens you up to more options. If you might get errors without the DBO, so you can always just add that to the statement to make sure you get no errors. And then when I click execute, it does exactly that. It selects all the students. Now, the wonderful thing about this is that it is reusable. I can select all students at any point, especially if I'm building an application. Most use cases for stored procedures would be that you use them to house the business logic, meaning you put all the intelligence inside the stored procedures and you really just call the stored procedure in your application when you need that kind of operation to be carried out. So that's one of the use cases for stored procedures. For this video, I'm going to go through other examples of stored procedures. And so this one was one without parameters. My next example is going to have parameters. Now I'm going to do one where I'm going to say select student by ID. So I'm going to go back to my stored procedures folder, right click, click stored procedure. And then the name of this stored procedure would be select student by ID. And then this procedure would have one parameter. So I'm actually just going to systematically replace all the errors in the angle brackets. So the first area asks for a parameter name. So I'm going to call it @ because in SQL, we define our parameters using the @. And then the data type, which is being asked for in the next section, would be int because we're accepting the ID that we want to use to return the student or find the student in question. So I only need one parameter. So I'm going to remove that comma and I'm going to remove that second line because I don't need it. And so I'm creating procedure select student by ID using this ID parameter of type int as, and then we begin the code. Now, to get the student by ID, it's a simple select statement, really. I'm sure if we were to do this in a regular SQL statement, we could do it. So I'm just going to repeat it. But in this situation, I'm going to use the ID as a variable because I don't know what ID is going to get passed. So clearly, we have to be selecting from the student table relative to the value that is being passed in through the parameter. So I'm going to say select star. So I'm replacing the angle bracket section from and our table students where, so we're adding our filter, and then I can say @ID and then I would say where the ID, because just to double check, we have the column called ID. So we want to find a student where the ID value is equal to whatever value we're passing into the stored procedure. So where the ID column is equal to our value being passed in, which is going to be stored inside of the parameter that we defined, which is @ID. So this query reads select star from students where ID is equal to whatever value the parameter has at that point in time. And then we can once again execute because this is a create procedure script. So to create the procedure, we have to execute. And then I'll go back to my script file here where I'm going to run another test. So I can say exec, then DBO, and then the name of the stored procedure, which is select student by ID. And then to pass in the parameter that is required, we need to reference the parameter by its name, which based on the definition of our procedure is @ID. So I say @ID, and then I give it a value. So @ID is equal to 3. So I want, or I expect that when I execute this statement and I run my stored procedure passing in the value 3 into the ID, it will execute this select statement where it's selecting from the students table where the ID value in the column is equal to 3 because that's what I'm passing in as the parameter value. And so when I execute this, or I'll just execute the entire script. So the top value, the top result set is my select all students. But then if you look below it, you see that it is bringing back the student with the ID 3. If I said 10, and executed, then nothing would come back because there's no student with the ID value of 10. So the point is as many values as I may need to pass in to the stored procedure to carry out the operation, I can define them as parameters. So all I need is a comma, and then I define as many parameters and the respective data types as I need. And of course, the last one has no comma. And then we can carry out some operation using SQL syntax that makes use of the parameters that we're passing in. So we've done 2 examples where we're selecting. Let's do one where maybe we're inserting. So I am getting a new student, and this student is coming into the school. The name is Francis Reed, and we can make up some other values. So the point is I want to create a stored procedure that allows me to insert students, and I don't want to have to write the insert statement every time I want to insert a new student. So I'm going to create a stored procedure that does the insert, and it just asks for the values to be inserted. So once again, I right click the stored procedures folder, click stored procedure, and go ahead and modify this template. So I'm going to call this stored procedure insert student. And then I'm going to list out all the parameters, and I'm going to make a parameter per column that will be inserted. So if we look back at our students table, and I'll just close all of the unneeded tabs here. So if we look back, we know that ID is auto-incrementing, so I don't need to pass in an ID value when inserting. However, I do need a last name, a first name, a date of birth, and an enrollment date. So that tells me I need to create a procedure that is prepared to take 4 values or 4 parameters for 4 columns. So I'm going to go ahead and define these 4 parameters. So I did say 4, but I defined 3. So I'm doing last name, first name, and date of birth. And I'm going to show you something. So the next one would have been enrollment date, but I am going to design the stored procedure such that the time or the date and time when you enroll the student or would have inserted the student is going to be the enrollment date. So I'm going to use a function to fill this column. I won't expect you to pass in that value as a parameter. All right, so let's finish the procedure and then we look at using the procedure. So I'm accepting these 3 columns, but I need to insert 3. So I'm inserting. So this time I'm going to remove all of that example, the select example, and instead I'm going to insert into my students table. And then we know that we list out our columns, which are last name, first name, date of birth, and enrollment date. And I'll just break the line. And then we have the keyword values. So we know that we don't abandon our basic CRUD SQL statements because they will come back to haunt us. We have to reuse them at any point. However, using the stored procedure, we don't always have to write this statement every time there's a student. So we can write it one time, save it as a procedure, and then leverage the procedure. So the values will be the last name value coming in from the parameter. So that would be at last name. So whatever last name is passed in when this procedure is called, we pass in the first name. So remember that whatever values we're defining here have to line up with the columns being defined. So last name to last name, first name to first name, and then date of birth to date of birth. And then I did say that I had a special way to deal with the enrollment date. So instead of passing in something as the enrollment date from the parameter, I am going to just use my function getDate, which will return the date and time of execution of the procedure. All right. So once I do that and close it off, my insert statement is complete. And I'm inserting into students, last name, first name, date of birth, enrollment date. And I can just create this procedure. So I click execute. And then this is a new procedure that I have access to. I'll just refresh my folder so we can see all of them. So we have insert student, and we can always expand and see all of the parameters that are required. And it says it returns an integer. And this integer is usually like a 1 or a 0 to say if it was successful or not. So let's test the execution of this. So I'm going to go back to my stored procedure query page, and then I'm going to once again say exec and then dbo. And then this stored procedure is insert student. And once again, you can always drag and drop it. So I'm going to drag and drop it just to show you that you can do that. Why not, right? And then to call this one, we have a few parameters, that we need. So we need the last name. Let me see if I can drag and drop that. I can't. So I actually have to type that one. So last name. And I did say the last name would be Reed. So remember that we defined last name in our store procedure to be an nvarchar. It's always a good idea to use the same data types as what the columns have. All right, so you would want to be passing in an int and then trying to insert int into an varchar or vice versa. So it's always a good idea to maintain that data type when defining the parameters. And then we'll comma separate all of the parameters that need to be there. So that's read, and then first name, which will have the value of Francis. And then the last one, and I'll just break the line so that we can keep everything within view. The last one would be the date of birth. And it's not exactly case sensitive either. And the date of birth could be maybe 1995-06-18. All right. So I'm just going to highlight this section and execute. And when we do that, we see commands completed successfully. No, we don't get anything else but that. The only way I can verify if this student was actually inserted is to go to my select all students, stored procedure, and execute. And there we see student number 13, read Francis, born 1995. And then if you take a good look at the enrollment date value, you see that it is an exact timestamp for the time that I executed this query. So that's how you can mix and match and use your functions in your queries and in your insert statements and use them to your advantage. So this would be the enrollment dates. The student would have been enrolled exactly on this date. If I wanted to get back details on only that student, then I could just execute select student by ID, and I could just say 13 and then execute. And there you would get back just the values for that student. And then let's try and put in an illegal value and see what happens. So if I put in a 1, so remember, well, that wouldn't be a good example because then it would probably still try to convert it to an n varchar. So let me put in a bad value for the date of birth. So I'll put in a 2 for the date of birth. So we know that date of birth needs to look like a year or a time, a date time kind of value. So I'm putting in just the number 2 and then I'm going to execute, and let's see what happens. And it says commands completed successfully. And I think it actually accepted it and tried to make sense of just the 2. So you see here, I keep on inserting read because I keep on executing the entire file, and it keeps on executing the stored procedure. So it's reusable. I didn't have to retype the insert statement every time I needed to. So I can always just change all these values, and for as many students as I want to insert, I just change the values, run the execute command with the stored procedure name, and I get that student inserted. So once again, stored procedures can basically house any kind of logic, any kind of SQL commands inside of them. You can use them to create records. You can use them to read records like we did. We did a create and we did a read. So I'm challenging you to do an update and a delete. Just create stored procedures, one that says update student, where you pass in the ID value as well as whatever values that you expect when a student is to be updated, and then you write the statement for that. And I challenge you also to do one for delete, where you put in delete student, pass in the ID and then you delete that particular student. So that's essentially how stored procedures work. Now, a very common practice after inserting a new row is to return the ID of the row that was just inserted. And even if that's not necessarily what you're returning, sometimes you want to give a return value because stored procedures are used for all sorts of things. They can be used for math. So maybe you pass in 2 values, you do some math, or you wanted to run some form of complex operation on something using a query, and then you just return a value. So the point is you can return values, and to do that, what you need to do is specify an output parameter. So I'm actually going to just modify this procedure that we've already done called insert student. And to modify a procedure, let's say we came back the day after. So I'm closing this and I have the stored procedure here. I can always right click it and go to modify, which will launch the same template, maybe with 1 and 2 extra lines. But the point is that instead of having a create procedure, I'm going to have an alter procedure. All right, so remember that the alter keyword is used instead of the create when the object exists already and we're modifying it. So in this situation, because we're modifying it, we have the alter. And then what I'm going to do is add a new parameter, and I'm going to call it student ID. And this will be an int. But then the important part that will differentiate it from all the other parameters is that it will have the keyword output. So then I know I'm defining this parameter as an output parameter, meaning you have to provide values for these, right? And then it does its operation, but then we're expected to give something to the output parameter for return. So student ID is my output parameter. I'm inserting a new student, and the expectation is that I'm going to return the ID of this newly inserted student, because, I mean, when we have a big school, we don't know how many students we have. We just want an output value. So I'm going to then say select and then say student ID. And then inside student ID, I'm going to assign what we call scope underscore identity. So that is just a little function that SQL gives us to allow us to return the pretty much the ID or the last scope value. So remember that identity is what helps it to count. So when we say scope identity, we're just returning the last count based on this operation. All right. So then having made those changes and altering, I have to now execute, because once again, this is a script. So I have to execute this alter command so that it will save the changes. And then we can try to execute this query again. So I'm going to change the names around. So I'm using a new student called Abby Thompson, and she was born the 5th of the 2nd in the year 2000. All right. So that's her date of birth. So I'm going to go ahead and execute, and that will then insert. So then it's saying that parameter was not supplied, which is the student ID, which is the one that I just put in as the output. And so we can go back to our definition and see what I left out. And I do believe I left out something in the execute statement. So there are a few things that we need to modify in our execution. So firstly, that output variable needs to exist in the context of our calling script. So this is our new script file. And just to eliminate confusions, I'm going to open up a brand new script file where we're going to use school, and then we'll start over. Now that we have used school, the next thing we want to do is declare some variable that kind of looks like the output variable. So my output variable is student ID. So I'm going to just declare another variable in this new script window called student ID with a data type of int also. Next, I'm going to execute my store procedure, and I'm just going to write exec, and you can actually write out the word execute. So, whichever one you feel more comfortable with writing. And then I'm just going to drag over the stored procedure. No problem, nice and easy. And then here's a clincher. You can actually just give values instead of writing out, oh, this is variable name equals that value. So if I remembered my parameter list correctly, I had last name, first name, date of birth. So I can actually just put in the values. So my first value is last name. So I'll put in Thompson. Then my next one is Abby, and then which is first name, and then date of birth is my third one, so I'll put in a date of birth. So if I remember, her date of birth was 200502, and then to end it all, I can just append student ID. And then after writing back the variable name, I need to actually put the keyword output once again. So when I execute this entire query file, because I can't just execute this line because the variable student ID is declared here. So I need the entire file where it goes sequentially, declares student ID, and then executes the command. And then I'll just put at the end of this, select student ID. So what it will do is execute the stored procedure, passing in Thompson, Abbey, and date of birth, doing what it needs to do, and then outputting the scope identity or the newly created ID value to student ID. And then I'm just going to store it in this section here with the output keyword. And then afterwards, I'm going to select it so it should be displayed in the result set. So I'm going to execute, and there we get that the newly created student ID is 17. And just to show you how reusable everything is, I'm going to put in another student. This time, the student's name is Doric White, and he was born 1985. And instead of just selecting the student ID, because I don't really want to see the student ID, I want to see the entire student record. So what I'm going to do is execute my store procedure dbo.select student by ID, and then I will pass in the student ID value as the parameter. So I'm just showing you how everything works together. So I'm executing insert student, and I'm passing in the values to execute against, and then I'm returning or outputting the value student ID or the newly created ID to a variable called student ID. And then in this next line, I'm going to use that student ID value to select that student using the other store procedure that I have called select student by ID. So I'm going to take student ID, and I'm going to replace that 13. So what it's going to do is when that variable stores the return value from the insert student stored procedure, I'm going to execute this next stored procedure, and I'm going to pass the value that is in that variable into the parameter for that function or for that stored procedure. Sorry. So when I click execute, then I will actually see the student's details coming back. There we go. So it's student number 18, Doric White, and all of the details that were just inserted. So this is how you can actually put things together to automate complex or potentially complex operations. Once again, when you're building your actual application on top of this database, you can put a lot of intelligence into your stored procedures, and it's just up to you to call them in a manner that is, befitting of a good user experience. At the end of this exercise, you would have learned how to start creating stored procedures in your database. You, once again, can go ahead and create stored procedures for any kind of operation, any CRUD operation, any operation in between, and you can reuse them using the exec keyword, calling the stored procedure, and passing whatever parameters values for whatever parameters you may have defined. If you didn't define any parameters, then you can just call the stored procedure like we did here with select all students.